Yeah, so we're on now, and thank you. I'm happy to have the opportunity to speak to this group. It's an interesting organization that seems to be very much tuned into the kinds of things that I'm working on. So I think this should be a good session for me and hopefully helpful to all of you. The theme is adaptively seeking win-win customer relationships for the digital era. That sometimes comes through as error, which sometimes is a Freudian slip, maybe. And I'm focused on FairPay, which is an approach I've been working on to give an idea, just a little bit of background. Many of you, I think, know this quote by Drucker about acting with yesterday's logic in times of turbulence. And I think FairPay is really a logic for tomorrow. I sort of like the way it fits that quote. It's not a product, it really is a logic and architecture, a process that evolves. Some background on me: I've been pioneering digital services for people since the late 60s, have been in diverse businesses and roles, both B2B and B2C. I have about 50 patents that have been licensed to many companies. So I've been steeped in disruption and particularly the business model crisis that has been affecting the content industries over the past 10 years or so. And in watching that develop, a few years ago, I sort of happened on what I saw as a new way forward, which at first seems like a very simple concept, but as I thought about it more, I realized it has pretty deep implications and seems to be a whole new logic that centers on value propositions, and it changes the entire focus of customer relationships from price to value. So as I've been developing this, basically this has become my mission to basically try to change the world, save some of these industries like newspapers, which have been really hurting, music, which is going through crises, and video and ebooks and others are sort of beginning to face those same challenges. And it creates new value, I think. So I've been working on a pro bono basis with businesses and academic partners to try and get research and trials and applications underway. And I'm still looking for collaborators and evangelists to help get these ideas out there and tested. And I'm offering to do free consultations with companies who might try it or people who can help get this idea proposed. There's a lot of background on this on the website that's listed there, fairpayzone.com. So to start, let me sort of set the stage with a thought experiment where you imagine an all-knowing economic demon. Some of you may be familiar with thought experiments from physics. Einstein did a lot of them. Some of the most famous are Maxwell's demon and Laplace's demon, which were demons that had these sort of magical powers of insight. So my economic demon is able to read the buyers and sellers' minds to learn what they think of the value in use and in context, how something is used, how you like it, the value you get, willingness to pay, ability to pay, and also to determine the economic value surplus of the value over the cost, and then to arbitrate a fair sharing of the surplus between the producer and the consumer. So basically the idea is this demon can set personalized and fair prices. So in practice, this can lead to better strategies. And actually, we were just talking before the call, the B2B value pricing or performance or outcomes-based pricing models, really, you can view it as an attempt to approximate this demon. Those are sort of heavyweight, complex things where you analyze the value and come up with a price through a complex process. What I'm going to be suggesting is a lightweight analog that's applicable to the B2C world. And so part of the question is, how well will that work? But I think the thought experiment is valuable in theory anyway, just to get better insights into our theories. So to start out, let's sort of review some basic principles. One is Adam Smith, and everybody knows his fundamental ideas about the relationship between supply and demand and the invisible hand, and how that's really been the basis for our economics. The problem with that is, in the digital world, it basically doesn't apply anymore because there's no scarcity of supply. So the invisible hand sort of flails around, and that's sort of the heart of the problem. So there's been this dilemma, and I'm focusing here primarily on digital offerings, content, services, software in network markets where you're dealing with people through the internet, through their phones, whatever. So I think it was 20 years ago, Stuart Brand talked about this dilemma. Information wants to be free because of infinite replication, but it also wants to be expensive because of the cost of creating it. And this is really sort of an unsolved problem. And I think we really have to think more deeply about our value exchange process, that we can't use the old logic, but we still need to sustain the producers. So we need to find a new way to balance the value, ability to pay, and cost, and all these things. And the question is how. So, I mean, the brief summary is adaptive win-win value propositions. And I'm using that little diagram of my daemon to sort of highlight areas where it runs through the thread here. So what I'm suggesting is building relationships around value exchange. Use computer-mediated relationships to power that. Cooperatively focus on perceived value and learn the right price for each customer at each time, each transaction, each cycle of the subscription. And you can think of this as an invisible handshake with each consumer, where you're agreeing to try and come up with this approximation of economically ideal pricing. And I'm going to talk about a process. And with this, I think we can share more value with more customers and do it more sustainably, which is obviously better for the business. And will also produce more value to society by bringing this value to more people. So let's look at prices. You know, we take for granted that the seller sets the price, but that's really so last century, because historically prices were personalized through personal negotiations with personal context, bargaining powers, relationships, communal norms applied where there was some caring, some even generosity. All of that started to change in the mid-1800s with the invention of the price tag department store, where these institutions wanted to sell to mass markets of consumers. They had to be scalable and simple and operationally efficient. So these price tags made it sort of a take it or leave it proposition, which moved people toward exchange norms and bargain hunting. And we've sort of been in a race to the bottom ever since, even though it's had huge productivity value. With e-commerce, that's changed to where, you know, we know that mass personalization is now feasible, one-to-one marketing, but it's still not being done very close to price, and people have been very scared of dynamic pricing because it hasn't been clear how to do it well. So that's what I'm trying to focus on. Now, another issue to understand with digital is that it really draws a focus onto this difference in price sensitivity. Customers are not the same, their experience is not the same. So if you build a long tail model of price sensitivity, which is different from the long tail of products that Anderson talked about, your set prices gives you the revenue in that green box, that the people to the left are people who are willing to pay your price. Many of them would pay more, but they don't. So you're leaving that money on the table. And then there's large numbers of people who won't pay your set price, but who might want the product at a lower price, which would be profitable because it costs almost nothing to serve them. So you're foregoing all of that amber revenue. So there's an opportunity here, and it's very dynamic and context dependent. So simple segmenting and tiering of your pricing doesn't really solve it. So we'll get to that in a minute. Another thing that's important is the idea of post-pay, and there was an amusing cartoon called Pay As You Exit, and there's a blog post about that. There's some links in here that you can follow. But the idea is to price the experience after it's known. Instead of asking before people try the product to set a price, do it afterwards. And that's strange because even most pay-what-you-want offers, which have gotten to be somewhat popular now, ask for a price up front. And you don't know the value, you have to put in a risk discount. Whereas if you ask for it afterwards, then people know the value and you're signaling trust and value, so it should be much more productive that way. The last sort of key thing about digital is the whole idea of a product breaks down. We've got the near zero replication cost, they're not discrete or scarce, and it's really access and entitlements and usage that you're selling. So it's an experience good or, really a service. So it's definitely a service dominant logic issue here. And this is all very measurable. Sorry. It's all very measurable, so there's a lot of data you can get now on the value for each consumer. So people have recognized free as a selling tool. There's the book by Anderson called Free that popularized freemium. Trials have been around. Pay what you want has actually been fairly successful in limited use, where surprisingly people do pay even when they don't have to. So the idea is, how do we better embrace this dynamic variability, and how do we better control the risk of the seller? So that led me to this idea of a variation on pay what you want, where you've got a balance of powers and it's not just the buyer who has total power. So the way it works is the seller selectively makes an offer to buyers and explains how the offer works. And how it works is that they decide to accept the offer, they use it for a period of time, and then they're asked to set a fair price after they know the value. So they're pricing it backward. The seller tracks the price, and he figures out if he thinks it's fair. And you ask for reasons for the pricing as to why you priced high or low, above a suggested price or below, whether you had problems, you liked the product, you didn't like it, in terms of quality, in terms of production values, various issues. So then based on that, the seller can decide, okay, this person is being reasonable, I'm going to make more offers. And can use the structure to try and nudge people to pay generously and discourage them from being too tight about pricing, because you won't continue it if you're not satisfied. So there's this balance between extending it forward and pricing it backward that over time converges on an agreed level of fairness. So looking in more detail at how this works in a real environment, say it's a newspaper subscription, a music subscription, songs on iTunes, you have a conventional set price model as your baseline, and you selectively offer some of your customers this FairPay option, and you structure your offering to have a basic product and some premium offers, so that you start out with basic products, you let them go through the cycle of trying it, setting prices, you decide how those prices are, and you go through a few cycles. You don't throw people out immediately as unfair, but you give them feedback based on what they say and what you think as to whether you think their pricing is on target. I'm sorry, I'm getting auto advances here. And so based on that feedback, you can offer them these premium offers. They know they can be downgraded, and so you're constantly nudging them upward toward the premiums and trying to frame these offers in the way that they recognize the value with suggested prices and recaps of what they did. So that gives you an adaptive value discovery engine that seeks to know what the daemon knows to figure out what the real value to the user is in context, and do it in a very individualized way that this can be adapted to each consumer in different ways in different segments of one, so that it's this process. So to look a little bit deeper at the process, it's building in this seller control and predictability, and through these managed dialogues, and there's a term choice architectures based on behavioral economics and behavioral psych, that you can really nudge people very effectively by being careful about how you architect their choices and how you frame the questions you ask them. So the seller reports the usage, reports the suggested price, and frames the rationale for the pricing and tries to nudge the buyer toward a generous price. The buyer then sets the price, gives their reasons. The seller evaluates the fairness, sort of makes clear these reciprocal value propositions, and decides whether to frame new offers, manages FairPay credit as to how much credit to have going until you get prices you're satisfied with, and the incentives. So you're constantly nudging these buyers towards suggested prices as a fair exchange, testing and reviewing your value propositions, and framing the incentives. So it's a constant multivariate testing through all of these transactions. So this, I like to think of it as a new twist on the invisible hand, that instead of a transaction at a time view that's distinct, balancing supply and demand, which on the left is what the traditional invisible hand does, you're now chaining this through time, through a relationship, and you're decoupling these pushes from the buyer and the seller over time into this chained structure over the relationship. So that's why I call it the invisible handshake, because you're agreeing to balance these powers over time and try to converge on a reasonable exchange of value and a sharing of the surplus. So again, we're aligning the price with value, and it's a very intuitive blending. It has to do with this co-creation of value. It emerges over the relationship. And it not only goes, it's not only the value from the provider to the consumer of the value in use, but the soft values, service, support, the participation, responsiveness, social values, triple bottom lines, all of that can get factored into this value dialogue that sets the pricing. So you don't need a triple bottom line that's separate. It factors into your real bottom line. It also factors in value from consumer to provider, not just money, but other currencies. There's a reverse meter that's been talked about in the newspaper world, where other currencies are attention to advertising, personal data that can be exploited, user-generated content, promotion, viral leads to others, and things of that sort. It can also extend through the value chain and the ecosystem, so that, like with music, the musicians, it can be known that they're getting X percentage of the revenue, and so people are motivated to reward the musicians that make the music, the journalists that make the news, and things of that sort. So this has potential to go through a value chain, at least to some degree. So some of the evidence that this can work, even though it hasn't been tested in its full form yet, there's been a whole lot of behavioral economics work related to pay what you want offers and some related kinds of offers. And it's shown that people do pay when they don't have to. They're not heartless profit maximizers. And it has to do with two things. One is traits, that people have traits and social values that relate to fairness and reciprocity and altruism and being accepted, and they want to be fair. And it's also situational. If you can move them towards social and communal norms, then they're especially inclined to be that way. If you move them toward the more economic quid pro quo kind of norms, then it's a more dollars and cents thing. But even companies can move people toward social and communal norms by building a relationship with value. Companies like Apple, Zappos, Warby Parker, Etsy have built followings based on the idea that they're good corporate citizens and they produce special value. They're not just selling schlock at the lowest possible price. Same thing with some car brands, BMW, things, Tesla, things like that. Using computer-mediated dialogue, which makes it easy to track this stuff in detail, and it also makes it easy once things sort of settle down to put it on autopilot with just exception changes so that it doesn't get too burdensome. There's a huge amount of big data and predictive analytics that can be applied to this to validate the dialogues, to confirm that the customers are being honest based on, if they said they hated the articles but they spent hours reading them, there's something wrong there. And there's this huge amount of data you can use to see how people are actually using the product. and you can then customize your offerings and how they're framed based on this data. So all of this lets you make these relationships much more adaptive and cooperative, nudging the buyers toward fairness to share the value surplus, fostering these communal norms, and segmenting the customers based on their fairness traits and the kind of value propositions that they respond to. Just to suggest this, I'm not going to go into detail now, but talk to people in the news business, the music business, and obviously if you have an established business, you're not going to want to suddenly change to FairPay and see how it works. You want to do it in a marginal controlled test that doesn't put things at risk. So some of the places that are especially interesting to try this are acquisition, where it becomes like a fuzzy freemium. Instead of 10 articles free and then you pay the full subscription, this is something that sort of scales up with a soft barrier as to where you start paying and how much. For retention, it's especially interesting if a customer wants to cancel their subscription. You might say, well, try this special FairPay offer and see how that works, especially people who have low usage, where the standard subscription price might not be fair at all. And you can justify, if they get a lower price, you can justify it because they're low usage. And that's an important factor, that where there's variation, you have reasons for justifying it based on how it's used. Premium is an important opportunity. Some newspapers like the New York Times have a premium service. They're now calling it Insider. And I think FairPay would be very nicely applicable there and easy to test. And then there's a bunch of other aspects here. So basically, I think you can change the game with FairPay to this invisible handshake and move things from commoditization toward engagement and loyalty over value propositions and long-term relationships. And it may seem complicated, and the programming is not trivial on the seller side to do this, but on the consumer side, I think it's really not as bad as it might first seem. If you think about tipping in a restaurant, it's easy and intuitive. You do a very multi-dimensional analysis in your head, and it's just, you know, was the service better or worse than average? Am I a regular here? Do I care about, you know, those kinds of soft factors? You don't have to leave anything, but almost everyone does, and most people leave a fairly typical tip, sometimes a very generous tip. So the idea is to delight your customers and give them pricing freedom to focus on value and get their loyalty. And it all comes to this idea of patronship, which I think is sort of the central concept from a business. You want patrons, not customers, not subscribers. So this is an emergent strategy. It makes your pricing legitimate, and I think it'll lead to higher profits and deeper market penetration. I wanted to add, for companies that do use advertising models, then the deeper market penetration gives them more advertising revenue, so they don't need quite as much subscription revenue to balance that, even though ad revenue is no longer what it used to be. So that's pretty much what I thought I would cover for this session. I think we're roughly at the 20-minute mark. So I want to open it up for questions. There was some possibility of doing, you know, further talks with getting into some more detail, and obviously I hope that you will spread the word if you have ideas on how to test FairPay in use, whether it's a university laboratory project or real-world trials. I'm very happy to discuss that, and I'm open to talk to people at no charge on a consulting basis on this. So with that, I can open it up to questions and comments.
This was great, Alex, and thank you so much. This was very great topic. Any questions, comments?
This is Jeff Saperstein. I'd like to ask a question, Dick. Thank you so much. It's a great topic. What is your sense on the emergence of crowdsourcing and crowdfunding as the economic model that is non-transactional, something like TripAdvisor, for example, or recipe communities for the New York Times, where you're looking at the ideas that are generated and aggregative by the community as the value rather than the transaction for the content, and that these new models could fit very nicely into your proposition. But I'm wondering what you're thinking about in terms of the evolution of crowd sourcing, in particular, in terms of the importance not only of the data of what you get from the crowd, but the insight in terms of what's popular, what sticks, et cetera, and how that leverages the relationship. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, yeah, that there definitely is a lot of parallel in that they're both getting to value, they're both building the relationship around the value. There are some basic differences, and I haven't given a whole lot of thought to, I haven't seen obvious clear tie-ins, but I think, as you suggest, there are opportunities to do that. I think it makes sense to use both approaches in, certainly in different aspects of your offers and how you're doing things. The crowdsourcing, for the most part, is sort of at a transaction level right now. It's doing, a single product launch or it's an open innovation type crowdsourcing. But things like Kickstarter and those things are mostly one-time. I'm funding a record project, a movie project, funding a newspaper for a period of time. And it also ties in with their tip jar models, which are another, there's a lot of things sort of in this whole space of pay what you want. Tip jars like Kachingle and Flatter that are trying to do a pay what you want for blogs and other content services. So they're sort of complementary to the crowdsourcing. And yeah, it's not real clear how you integrate all of this into a cohesive structure. I view this as sort of FairPay as one direction, and I think it could subsume those things. Exactly how that will evolve is not real clear to me right now, but it's definitely something I think is worth thinking about. And if you're interested in talking about it, if that's something you're involved in, I'd be happy to talk about it more.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Haluk, this is Ralph. I just actually wanted to comment that I think this talk was really stimulating and interesting, and I think you're right on track with where service science is going. It seems that this whole idea of fair pay dovetails beautifully with customer journey modeling and journey analytics, which is an emerging field. I like the idea also, something that I've been trying to promote is the idea that a value proposition that is crafted ahead of time and then the service delivered is actually a goods dominant approach to service. I think what you're suggesting is something that I've been trying to work on, that a value proposition emerges through the service itself, and it's not like a blueprint that you draw up ahead of time, which is the orientation that a lot of people still have. So I think you're way out in front here with all of this. And the non-monetary currencies being exchanged, I think you're making the invisible hand visible. Frankly, when we look at this dynamic, development of what's going to be exchanged, so I think this research is terrific, and it's spot on for where service science is today.
Great.
So I hope we get to hear from you in the future.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. That's sort of what I was hoping, and I think I think I've heard of customer journey modeling and such, but your comments are very interesting. So I'd like to get, if you've got things written up on this, or I'll look into it. But if you want to send me an email with some specific links or items, that sounds very interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments? We are right at time. And okay, I guess Rick, thank you so much. I mean, this is like Ralph mentioned, this is a very intricate presentation, and it's a whole different way of moving away from transaction cost-based economics, right, to the relationism, and more trust, and it's still some risk taking, but who takes how much risk, I guess, in this invisible hand approach. And
Yeah. Thank you very much.
but this was very great. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody. It's around a couple minutes past 8 o'clock, and thank you for your participation. Thank you again, Rick. Rick, have a wonderful day.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, everybody.